Hi, everybody. It's going to be a little bit difficult to start giving a talk after Zainab's very emotional talk, but I will try to get you to engage with me, hopefully. I'm going to start with a list of disclaimers today. First of all, I am an identity researcher, and I have done stuff about prejudice, but that has mostly been peripheral to my own research. And I want to establish myself as a prejudice researcher as well, so that's why it was a great opportunity for me to get involved with these collaborators in this research. And I do lots of work with Joel Anderson, and then these two other guys who are from the US approached us and wanted to do this study together. So initially, we would focus on like a full picture of looking at attitudes towards Syrian refugees living in the US and experiences of Syrian refugees living in the US, which was, the title was like this, but I'm not going to let you read, and I'm going to skip to this again, because it's slightly changed. So we had, so seeing that amazing data set kind of make me think about, how we couldn't get data from the refugees in the US properly so that we could analyze and present here. But I'm going to talk about that very briefly. But to compensate for that, I added 2 more studies. So hopefully it's going to be a full presentation today. So I'm going to give a full picture. Nick and Adam really tried to get refugee a sample for us. They are living in Chicago, and the way when they approached us, what they said was like they were volunteering in the center called Chicago Syrian Network, and they were helping Syrian refugees. And we actually started the data collection, and then we have some data, usable data from about 20 people. But the challenges were mostly the fact that we had to do the study on pen and paper or on an iPad when the researchers were present there, because it was an experimental study and we needed to properly debrief the participants. And also when we gave the surveys away, people would do it in families and they would talk about different experimental manipulations, and it just wouldn't work for us. So over the last 4 months, we could get only data from 20 people, and hopefully it's going to be a full circle of studies when we finish that data collection as well. So I'm going to give a very little background because we have been talking about this already, but this is the total number of Syrian refugees that has been increasing since 2012 all over the world. And these are the 5 major countries and European Union that has accepted Syrian refugees into their countries. And as you can see, Turkey is one of those countries that has accepted most of them. And also it feels a little bit weird for me because I'm originally from Turkey, live in the UK, and talking about Syrian refugees, attitudes towards Syrian refugees in the US. So, but yeah, I wanted to bring that on the table as well. So there are some lots of charts if you Google Syrian refugee crisis, and you would see these kind of things. And this was from Oxfam's Fair Share about donations. And these are the countries that did lots of donations for the humanitarian appeals. And as you can see, I'm going to be focusing on United States today. And United States did quite a lot of donations with respect to what their fair share is, 76%, as compared to most of other countries. There are countries like Russia, which is like 0%. But when it comes to resettlement and the fair share, we see that there are some countries like Norway, Canada, Germany, which has done quite a lot, but United States is like 7%. So when it comes to actually bringing them here and helping them, that is not really happening. So these are the places in the US that Syrian refugees have been resettled. So I think so far it has been 12,000 Syrian refugees that have been resettled in the US, and they are being resettled strategically to match where there are Syrian populations so that they can actually have some sort of contact with their home countries. And as you can see, it's really hard to look at here and then point there. Chicago is there, and it's an area that there are actually lots of Syrian refugees. When there is only like about 10,000 refugees, it's in a country like United States, which is quite vast. You would expect, obviously, but you wouldn't want to see lots of negative representations on the media. But like these are some of the things that I've just pulled out, and things like US underneath pressure to absorb Syrian refugees as Europe faces crisis. And then Tucker Carlson, he's at Fox News, and then he was like talking about this. What does the United States get out of this by helping Syrian refugees? or more than half of the nations go in and say Syrian refugees are not welcome, and there are like lots of polls and talking about that refugees are not welcome. So what is happening about that? And as you can see, Daily Mail, which is not from the United States, but these news also travel to the other side of the ocean, and they are very popular in the UK as well. So this is what is happening. So overall, what we wanted to do is, what I'm going to present today is we wanted to understand what actually predicts prejudice in the form of social distance, I'll talk about today, towards Syrian refugees in the US. And also in the second and third studies are experimental studies. And in the second study, that should be minority influence. Can minority influence affect social distance towards Syrian refugees in the context of acculturation and migration? And in the third study, which is a really, really nice, small, basic, simple, lovely study, can we target some sort of intergroup anxiety, and then can that lead to decreased social distance? I'm going to start with conceptualization. So we use social distance as a prejudice measure in the study, and the reason for this was that I have quite a few colleagues, and we want to do some studies in Europe, and we want to use measures that could work in every single culture. So we didn't want to have very specific attitudes towards refugees scales which would work in the US or in Turkey, because these are the context would be really different. So we decided to revive this Bogada scale and bring that into picture. And then if you look at these definitions of social distance and some definitions of prejudice by Rupert, who is my second supervisor, by the way, for my PhD, we could see that there are quite links there. So the degree of sympathetic understanding that functions between a person and a person, between person and a group, and between groups. And Rupert's, in his book, so any attitude, emotion, or behavior towards a member of a group which directly or indirectly implies some negativity or antipathy towards that group, which was a working definition, by the way, so I should say that. So these are quite parallel, so we thought that maybe we could actually use social distance as a prejudice measure. And in the first study, we just wanted to see what could predict social distance, and these are the potential predictors that we thought could be useful, because I do some prejudice research and we always look at RWA, STO, and religiosity, and national identification is also related to prejudice, and also in this case we want to incorporate intergroup anxiety as a predictor. So I'm just going to give very brief introductions why this could be the case. So we use national identity here as a specific form of social identity, and it links between national identity. So the links between national identity and prejudice have been documented in various research. So national identity basically predicts art group rejection or blatant and subtle forms of prejudice. And also we have done some research in Turkey looking at attitudes towards Kurdish people from the majority's perspective, and national identification predicted prejudice against Kurds in Turkey along with RWA and SDO. Also, these two ideological variables are always pop up in my mind when we talk about prejudice. So we know that RWA and SDO are highly correlated and they predict different dimensions of prejudice. On the one hand, RWA is right-wing authoritarianism, by the way, is regarded as a social attitudinal expression of values of collective security and order, and as opposed to personal freedom and self-expression. So people demand more social cohesion, order, stability, and they are more keen on tradition. On the other hand, STO is regarded as a social attitudinal expression of personal of group power, dominance, and superiority, as opposed to egalitarianism, humanitarianism, and universalism. So if you think about the context, you would expect that this could be actually related. And also some previous very recent research showed that along with macro-justice principles, RWA and STO significantly predicted attitudes towards asylum seekers in Australia, with research done with my colleagues and done by my colleagues. And also when we were looking at this stuff, we always kind of drew our research from attitudes towards asylum seekers, immigrants, refugees, but most of the stuff comes from Australia. And Again, the relationship between religiosity and prejudice is also well documented. So higher extrinsic orientations are related to higher prejudice, and there are research which shows that there are research which shows very similar things in different samples. So that was the rationale. But when it comes to intergroup anxiety, it was really interesting to think about this as a predictor for social distance. From our perspective, we just wanted to test this because intergroup anxiety is the area that we want to do our interventions, which I'll be talking about in the third study especially. So intergroup anxiety has been useful in understanding success or failure of intergroup contact, and less or poor contact is strongly related to intergroup anxiety, and also it predicts bias against the outgroup. So that's the way that we actually started thinking about this as a predictor. And also intergroup anxiety could be rooted in self-presentation concerns, and also it could be related to negative outgroup stereotypes, and that was actually the latter that made us think as a predictor in this case. So in this first study, it was a very basic study, so we wanted to see what predicts social distance as a measure of prejudice against Syrian refugees in the US. So we had 155 participants. As you can see, the mean age is quite high, so it was mostly an MTurk participants, but also we had participants recruited via social networks. And it was a correlational design. What we did was we used all these predictors along with age and gender, and we put social distance as an outcome measure, and they were all on 7-point scale with higher scores indicating higher agreement. In the case of social distance, higher scores indicating higher social distance. And so most of the stuff comes with the scales that are already very well established in the literature. For religiosity, we use the scale that we developed recently, which has not been published yet, but it works well. So the regression results are here. So in the first block, we just put all the demographic variables, and in the second block, we put our hypothesized predictors. And it was only RWA, and religiosity and intergroup anxiety were the significant predictors, and these are the standardized values. As you can see, anxiety has the higher predictive value for social distance. So this is a summary. But whenever it comes, whenever we do research with prejudice, religiosity or religious fundamentalism comes as a predictor, or RWA comes as a predictor. But it's really hard to do some interventions targeting those variables. What are you going to do? Can you help? Can you decrease people's right-wing authoritarianism values or orientations? So we thought that maybe intergroup anxiety and religiosity could be areas that we could do something. Religiosity in the sense that we could reframe some ideas. I was talking to Winifred yesterday about that. For example, if you use a line from Quran or Bible which kind of reflects golden rule, saying everybody's equal, we should be accommodating of different social groups, and we should not be prejudiced other people. So maybe if people are religious, so reframing their connection to religion might be useful, reducing prejudice. So in the second study, we just looked at, so this whole study started as an acculturation study, and then it just evolved into different stuff. So this is how we are framing it now. And this whole, the second study was about, can minority influence affect social distance towards Syrian refugees in the context of acculturation and migration? So what I mean by all of these three operationalizations that I need to talk about. Again, research on acculturation, orientation, and intergroup relations have been established. Lots of citations from Rupert. And so when there is a preference for cultural maintenance, this could be linked to less threat and more acceptance, and this could actually help intergroup relations in a positive way. So more favorable intergroup attitudes towards the majority from the minority perspective, but also majority might perceive the minority in a positive way. Mostly in the case of integration and assimilation, because minority do cultural maintenance, but at the same time they incorporate they are happy to accommodate things from the majority sample. But one of the things that Rupert was talking about in this chapter was this should be coupled with desire for contact. So, for example, in one study, which is very similar to what we have done, they have used a video study, and then there was Pakistani minority members, and they were talking about how they would like to acculturate. And what the study found was there was a causal effect of perceived acculturation preferences. So if the person in the video said they want to integrate, and the participants' orientation for what they would want from the immigrants would be integration, but this effect was moderated by the level of prejudice. So this only happened when there was low levels of prejudice already. So how we frame this with respect to minority influence, I'm not entirely convinced by this, but my collaborators suggest this is the idea. But I'm kind of convinced. I'm convinced with this part in the sense that, so in our study we use so assimilation and integration strategies, and then they suggested that so assimilation is in-group normative for the majority, and out-group normative is integration, because that comes from the minority's perspective. So that kind of makes sense. Maybe Jessica can say something about that. So I'm not going to talk much about minority influence, but that was our rationale. And also, so during the interaction, the relationship between minority and population might rely on the argument mobilized by the minority, but most minority influence research suggests that only in-group sources are effective at the manifest level. But related attributes can also be contextually made salient during social interaction, and they might determine if the population identifies with or rejects the minority based on this interaction. So we wanted to see if they saw from the minority's perspective that they wanted to acculturate or integrate, it might change their perceptions of social distance. And the other one was about, so we had a 2x2 design, which I'll talk about, and the other one was the type of migrant that we used. So we were not sure about this, and then this evidence is really mixed. I have also seen in the talks since yesterday, so if asylum seekers, economic migrants, or refugees are perceived similarly or differently. So we also wanted to test this, but we know from yesterday from Ravina's talk that actually they see no difference in the US, which, spoiler alert, we didn't see any difference. So in the second study, we had 185 participants. Again, this was more than half MTurk sample, and the others were students. And we use social networks, our friends teaching at universities, and it was a 2x2 design. So what we did was we used some vignettes, and we asked participants to read these vignettes, and then we manipulated the type of refugee and type of acculturation. Also, since we know from the first study, RWA, religiosity, and intergroup anxiety makes a difference, so we have controlled for these variables. So this was the design. So the participants completed the individual difference measures, and then they were randomly assigned to one of those 4 conditions. And then we had manipulation checks, and then we had the social distance as our outcome variable, and then we debriefed them. So this was how the manipulation looked. So we were talking about, there was a project which asked citizens of United States about their perceptions of refugees, and this focuses this. So as you can see, in this first one, we used humanitarian. So in the 2x2 design, that is changed with economic migrants. And also, we give them the definitions of integration, assimilation, and separation. And in one study, in one condition, we say they want to integrate. The majority of the minority wants to integrate, and in the other one, we say assimilate. And then we had the manipulation checks, especially when you use an MTurk or student sample, which are the only samples that we actually have access to. Manipulation checks are really, really important. We also had some attention checks. It's things like, please circle strongly disagree for this question so that they wouldn't just go down. Anyway, and the exclusion criteria was based on the checks that if they failed either of these questions, they were excluded. So we asked them what orientation did the paper suggest, and then what type of refugee did the paper talk about. So we did the 2x2 ANCOVA, controlling for RWA, religiosity, and intergroup anxiety. And This is the first time I'm actually presenting an experimental study with these figures, and I'm really excited because I always talk about path analysis, so I'm going to now point this red thing here. And there was a significant main effect of acculturation type on social distance, but unfortunately it was on the way that if participants were in the integration condition, they had higher levels of social distance than if they were in the assimilation condition, which is kind of bad news. But there was no main effect of migrant type, so this kind of like corroborates the findings from yesterday as we were talking about. Maybe it's just it doesn't do anything. And also all of these results and means are when the other variables are being controlled for. And also, unfortunately, there was no significant interaction, which is a shame. I would want to talk more about them. But RWA, religiosity, and intergroup anxiety were actually significant predictors when we controlled for them. So it was really useful to measure these things, but also they actually made the results more robust. And then we started thinking about these, like what we can do, like what are we going to do here? We need to make decisions, like we need to use these variables or one of them as moderators and see how these relationships work. And since we were interested in intergroup anxiety, we wanted to try moderation model using the anxiety as a moderator. And this goes back to the suggestion by Rupert that this, there are more favorable attitudes towards the minority if they maintain their culture. And this should be coupled with desire for contact. So what we did was we did this moderation analysis, controlling for religiosity and RWA, and the acculturation type predicts social distance, moderated by intergroup anxiety. Yay, there was a significant moderation. Normally I use M+ for my analyses, but my license expired, so I had to... And I'm a PhD student, I can't afford it, so I had to use a process, but it worked for the purpose. And so basically what happens is, if there is, if at the low level of intergroup anxiety, the social distance for assimilation and integration are pretty much the same, but when people have high levels of anxiety, in the integration condition, the social distance increases. Does that make sense? Okay, so then what can we do about intergroup anxiety was the next question, which is the lovely experiment that I'm going to talk about now. And so can we actually target intergroup anxiety and can this do something for the social distance, for this prejudice? And then I love to do stuff based on daily things rather than just looking at what has been done in the literature or what we could do in the study. What we did was, it was a very simple design. There was an experimental condition and a control condition. And we, again, had only M-type participants in the study, and 55% was males. And then what we did was very similar individual difference measures, manipulation checks, outcomes, debrief, and then they went to the experimental or control condition. We control for these again. And have you heard of Humans of New York? Anyone didn't hear before? So it is a series of pictures of people living in New York and their stories and what they have done. And there was a series about Syrian Americans, so how they left Syria and then they lived in Turkey for a while, or they crossed with the boat and then they resettled in the United States. And they were actually really, really nice, quite touching, and kind of like happy, ends with a happy life sort of stories. And I really enjoyed reading this, and then they compiled this as a book, and now they're obviously selling it. But it's like a big Facebook thing. Everybody shares these stories daily. And then I was like, maybe if we get people to get exposed to some sort of like humanitarian things or these kind of things, maybe it could help with this intergroup anxiety thing. So this is from the website. So what we did was, like, in one condition we just had all the measures. In the other condition, the experimental manipulation was we got the participants to read one of the 10 Syrian stories. So they've seen all of these things. So the story was about two boys and their family, and then they were talking about how they resettled in the US. So the story went like this: we turned our trash can into a dinosaur because he always wanted to work with dinosaurs. He wanted to be a scientist. So all those things, what happened before the war, and then what was going on during the war. These were their pictures, all from the website, and what happened to them. And then, yeah, and then finally, happy life at the end because they are now in the US and they're going somewhere called Clearwater in Florida, and things will be fine for them. So this was a picture at the airport, and then last image that the participants see. So we again had manipulation checks, asking people were they aware of these stories before, or would you recommend this story to someone or share with others just to see their attention, and how did you feel about the story you read? So these are like things maybe might be subjected to like qualitative analyses later, but they were like mostly quite emotional things, but sometimes you would read things like, yeah, very nasty things about Syrians. So in this one, what we had was after manipulation, we measured intergroup anxiety and social distance. Yay. So this is the score for anxiety score. So we had tried to kind of like target the intergroup anxiety, and between experimental condition and control condition, there was a significant difference. But we did this experiment to see like in a mediation model. So what we were expecting to see was condition would predict less intergroup anxiety, and then that would predict less social distance. And again, we control for RWA and STO because they have been consistent predictors so far. And yes, it happened. So being in the experimental condition predicted intergroup anxiety negatively, and that predicted social distance. So that predicted less social distance. So these are unstandardized coefficients, but in the next slide, I have this indirect effect, which is robust because the confidence intervals don't cross 0. Does it look good? So being exposed to some sort of alternative representations, because if you remember what I presented from the media at the beginning, of Syrian refugees kind of decrease intergroup anxiety and indirectly social distance, and these real-life encounters, even online, actually can help reduce intergroup anxiety and social distance, and this might be really useful and it might be quite promising for larger intervention, especially if you want to do these studies in different countries. And yeah, so all over we looked at the predictors, and then we also talked about acculturation a bit, but I didn't really go into detail on that. But we kind of had a successful, I call that in inverted commas, because it's just a small study. It needs to be replicated maybe to reduce intergroup anxiety and social distance. So next steps is I need to do more theoretical reading, so that's why any feedback is welcome. And so we want to extend this research into UK, where I live now, and into Turkey, where I'm from, and into European Union countries, where I have collaborators, and we just want to see how we can try out and harness such interventions. And any feedback and theoretical contributions are welcome. Thank you.